You're listening to TuneDig, a podcast for music lovers. The premise is simple. We dig into an album to discover what makes it interesting, and then we dig into the crates for a vinyl copy to give away to one lucky winner.
Go to TuneDig.com for your chance to win, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter for more info about the album that didn't make the episode.
Today we're talking about Otis Blue by Otis Redding. There's no such thing as a best record. Having said that, if someone were like, what do you think is the best record? This would be on the short list of things I considered. What gets the closest to lightning in a bottle in a very different way than, say, a Thriller or a Dark Side of the Moon or an Abbey Road? What does it look like to capture a moment so perfectly that it stands the test of time 55 years later? Stands apart from its contemporaries. It still has a lot of meaning in terms of its historical context and what the artist was doing at that moment. And the material is so good that no matter who takes it on, it's still good. I think that's one of the enduring things about the 60s is the songcraft. Like, people just wrote these really, really good, basic, elemental, wonderful songs. I know we'll get into a lot of what's on this doesn't belong to the man who sang it, but he made it its own, and in turn, he made it everybody's. This album blows my mind. Like, I'm so excited to talk about this. I think this is one of the greatest things that ever happened in American music history. I will die on that hill.
It seems like part of the reason that might be the case is because Otis Redding was so pumped to do it.
That's right.
It's an interesting way to look at. You use the lightning in a bottle metaphor a fair amount to think about the density of what comes out of a musical album. This one, as compared to, the ones that you just brought up, right? Thriller, Dark Side of the Moon, but a lot of the other ones we would think of, this one of all of them, or this one of all of the ones that a lot of people think of, is probably the most reproducible if Otis Redding was still alive, because so much of what's here is just what was inside of Otis Redding. And that's not to say that Booker T and the MGs are not important, and I know that we're going to talk about that plenty, but like, Otis Redding contained within him such energy that was on display here and that you could see elsewhere that was incomparable. Just even the stories of how he would nervously wait backstage and sort of appear uncomfortable until he walked out and immediately commanded control of everything and was able to collect and capture all of the attention of everyone within earshot is one of those rare things that we don't get from a singular human being very often.
There's the myth of the person who was born to do it, right? We talked about it with Prince a lot. Because Prince was such a maximum effort musician that made hard stuff look easy, but there were hours and hours and hours of work and reps and practice behind that. We always think about Michael Jordan when we talk about that sort of thing, but like, that's the same person that got cut from his high school basketball team and always put in the reps. Michael and Kobe both, they outworked all of their competitors. Otis Redding died when he was 26 years old, and there was such a pure effortlessness to the way that he did everything that when people bandy around words like genius or greatest of all time, it gets really cagey when you do stuff like that. But we have a great portrait here with Otis, somebody we didn't have for a very long time at all, somebody who didn't appear to have to try that hard and yet had a supreme confidence and a supreme ability to deliver again and again until he died. And this is the perfect little encapsulation of what that looked like, because so much of the rest of his output was singles, because he was a product of his time. But this is a whole complete little statement. This is like the most Otis Redding, arguably, that Otis Redding got. And I think that starts with like the core thing that comes out about this record when you're reading about it, and that's 10 of the 11 songs were recorded in a 24-hour period between 10 a.m. Saturday, July 9th and 2 p.m. Sunday, July 10th of 1965, only taking a break from 8 p.m. Saturday to 2 a.m. Sunday to allow the house band to play local gigs around Memphis. That 11th song was lead-off track Old Man Trouble, and it came from an earlier session in April of that year. So essentially, this is one live gig, more or less, in the studio. Many of the tracks were recorded on their first or second take. So Ryan Pinker, who used to do editorial for Tidal, said, in other words, this is Otis unpolished and in his element. This is the realest and rawest in the microscope look you're going to get at this dude. And yet somehow the result is just about flawless.
The idea that this is him at his most raw feels so ridiculous when you listen to this. It feels like the best take out of 1,000 takes.
Yeah. It's extremely tight. Now, to your point, that's not all him. He has the supreme privilege of having the heavyweight backing band of all heavyweight backing bands.
The Stax Sound.
The Stax Sound. The Sound of Memphis. So the house band at Stax was Booker T and the MGs, who...
I hope people know they wrote Green Onions.
Do
we have to say that?
Yeah, this is the part where we just stop for a moment of silence that is Green Onions clip. I saw a great talk, a Creative Mornings talk. One of the best ones I've ever seen was Chuck Reese, who founded the Bitter Southerner. And the theme of the talk was identity. And he was talking about what does it mean to be Southern. And there was a lot of, it's not this, it is this. And he specifically pointed to Booker T and the MGs. And he played a clip of Green Onions. And a hush fell over the crowd when the Green Onions clip played. But this band was sort of revolutionary in that they were integrated in the Deep South, just casually black dudes and white dudes chilling, playing in the same band like it was nothing. Years and years and years before the Allman Brothers or people like that made it a thing. It was diversity and inclusion on full display. And those dudes ripped, you know. It was Booker T. Jones on the keys, and he was the band leader. It was Steve Cropper on guitar. Donald Duck Dunn on bass. One of the all-time great bassists, and Al Jackson Jr. on the drums, who, like so many other moments in the Stax catalog, is one of the MVPs on this record.
You can tell that they feel it.
Yeah.
They didn't just lock in and perform it as if, I mean, it's rare that describing a record as feeling raw and feeling live comes out like it felt like everyone really wanted to get this out of their system. And individually, like you've brought out some great moments, and I'm sure we'll talk about some here. But there are these places where you can isolate the instruments and hear people. It's almost like you can feel them going, yeah, and just leaning into whatever they're playing. It felt like everyone really wanted to record this.
They're feeding off of each other for sure. Yeah. So in addition to the MGs, which in and of itself would be wild, right? You have Isaac Hayes on piano on this thing, which maybe at that exact moment wasn't as wild as it would end up becoming. You know, this was pre-Black Moses and Hot Buttered Soul and all that stuff. But you have Isaac damn Hayes playing on this record. And I didn't learn this. I was like years old when I learned that he was part of the fabric of this record. And it elevated it so much for me. The same guy that wrote Walk On By played on this record. Like, this is insane. You know the story, and we'll get into this as well. Like, Aretha Franklin was just the neighborhood girl who came down and sang in the studio. It was almost cosmic, the level of talent that was around and attracted to the orbit of this little studio. that if you've never been to Memphis, I can't recommend it highly enough. Like,
it's like the reason to go to Memphis is to
God.
feel whatever is there.
Yeah. And it's magic. It's palpable. The organ that Green Onions was played on is still sitting in the A room there, and you can sit at it and look at it, and you can just feel it. It's magical. And Sun Records is in Memphis as well, right? And that's its own thing, and it's really cool. With all due respect to Sam Phillips and what happened across town at Sun, Stax is, like, again, a very important component of the fabric of American history. Like, not just American music history, American history, period.
It's like the blues version of a Sedona energy vortex that sits somewhere in Tennessee that makes great barbecue and makes you feel like maybe you could be truly cool for just a second.
Yeah. Memphis is indescribable. We are obviously, if you have been a listener of this podcast for any amount of time, you are well aware of how proud we are to be from where we are from. Very proud Southerners, and we love being from Atlanta. And having said all that, Memphis is one of the coolest places in the South and in the country. Disarmingly so, right? Like you are driving into town, and you're like, all right, it's working class. It seems kind of regular, and you do Beale Street, and you're like, all right, this is cool. But then you get into the pockets, and you go to one BYOB blues club, and you're like, this is the tightest place that there is. And then there's that place over on the west side by the factories that makes the biscuits. And you're like, I never want to leave here, ever.
Sorry, I'm imagining people who have never really interacted with Southerners going, did that guy just say, there's this place over there that makes the biscuits? And the other guy knows what he's talking about.
Not a metaphor.
Yeah, fam.
Not a metaphor. Literal biscuit place.
Biscuits are an art.
I just can't remember the name of it. But you go, and it's like all the dudes in the coveralls in line there, and you're like, oh, the people that are about to go to work are waiting in line for this. It's about to be real good. Getting back to Otis, though, there is such a pride in Otis and a loyalty in Otis about where he came from that gets highlighted really nicely in a book that Jonathan Gold wrote called Otis Redding: An Unfinished Life. And the whole first bit is about Georgia and him being from where he's from. And it doesn't seem super important on its face, but it gets really important when you think about him in comparison to the artists that he's covering. Specifically Sam Cooke. There are 3 Sam Cooke covers on this record. Sam Cooke was not a Motown artist, but had that Detroit smoothness, had that kind of cosmopolitan Detroit, Chicago, LA smoothness, where in the context of 1962 to 1964 was very palatable for white America. Very, very pre and presently racial America. There are some really interesting articles that talk about how, like, certain types of black artists got to cross over into mainstream success. Fats Domino, Chubby Checker, Little Richard, because they had these qualifiers like they were big, they were blind, they were flamboyantly effeminate that made them othered and kind of okay. And that same article said there was no coincidence that Chuck Berry, just being unapologetically really awesome and also coincidentally black, was an artist who got arrested on morals charges. Amazing that they used to call it that and didn't code the language back then. Simpler times. But there was something so amazing about Otis Redding, by contrast, that he seemed really demure and they use the phrase stood stock still for a long time in his career. But then he would get really animated later in his career with like up-tempo numbers. And he had such a confidence, such a bravado. And at 6'1", 200 plus pounds.
Before we get too far away from it too, just to give a little extra context to the Sam Cooke thing, Sam Cooke had just been murdered in December.
6 months before this record came out. Yeah.
Yeah. So there are 3 songs from Sam Cooke, and I would encourage you to go read the actual news article that covers Sam Cooke being shot, because it's, without going too far into it, it is an interesting artifact of history where you can read it and the story is told to you very matter-of-factly that essentially, Sam Cooke had kidnapped and was trying to force himself on someone who went and found respite in another hotel room, and he was shot by someone defending that lady. And it's an interesting artifact of history to create some context for what you were just talking about, because looking at it now, your eye starts to twitch a little bit. Like,
Oh, you